Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton is beginning to make staff changes, including adding an offensive line coach to the mix, on top of interviewing a potential candidate for defensive coordinator. What does it mean for other members of the Broncos coaching staff from last year? You get that and much more from the South Stands to the end zone on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. Joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. Sayre, my friend, here in Phoenix for Super Bowl Radio Row Week. Have some really big things in store and some guests. Get to sit down with former Bronco Shelby Harris this week. Get to talk with former Bronco and Super Bowl 50 champion Emmanuel Sanders about Sean Payton, about some of the other things here. I'm excited to share some of those insights with the avid listeners on the show here this week. But you know what, my friend? We're continuing on here as Sean Payton, the official era has begun in Denver after Monday's introductory press conference. On top of that, Payton is already beginning to make some staff changes. And at the press conference, he wasn't too keen on revealing who he was bringing on, what positions he was changing. But there was even a nugget. There was a move that happened while the press conference was going on for the Broncos and for Sean Payton's staff.
Yeah, it was kind of a breaking news bit there right in the midst of the press conference. Obviously, Sean Payton bringing along somebody that he had worked with for a very long time as far as a coach-player relationship, Zach Strief, Cody. I remember the name because I remember he played at a very high level for a very long time, then obviously became an assistant for the Saints there. So that's going to be the Broncos' new offensive line coach. I know there was rumors about could Sean Payton or anybody in that head coach chair, could they bring back Mike Munchak? Could they bring in Dan Ruchar, the longtime Saints offensive line coach? Don't necessarily know that you can rule maybe one or two, I don't know, either of those guys out at this point for a different role in the staff. But if it's not the offensive line coach, it'd be interesting to see how you would work those guys into the equation. So I think for the time being, kind of assuming that both Dan Ruchar and Mike Munchak, kind of the high profile offensive line coaches, are for the time being out of the mix for the Denver Broncos.
Well, I think one thing you have to look at when we talk about like personnel related decisions, right? Coaching staff, you always have to factor in sometimes new coaches don't want to include some of the former coaches from the previous regime because there's a belief that sometimes those old coaches could be holding on to, you know, whatever happened the last year and whatnot. Sometimes you like to start fresh, but in a situation like this with Strief, I remember him being a captain for the Saints offensive line, you know, and that's huge. Like when you have that captain patch on your jersey alongside a guy like Drew Brees, I mean, I think that speaks volumes. But I always like to do what you do in situations like this, right? And you taught me well over the years. Anytime a move happens, you go on Twitter and you look at how the fan base of, you know, whoever he was coming from is reacting. I mean, beat reporters, beat writers over there, people who cover the Saints were like, this is a tremendous loss here for the New Orleans Saints. And, you know, I think that gives me optimism. I trust what Sean Payton is doing, right? And when it comes to assembling a staff, I get that there's some skepticism considering the inexperienced route. But I look at Sean Payton knowing exactly what he's doing and bringing in people who is going to, you know, who are going to do the things that he asks of them from a coaching standpoint. So as it stands right now, like Sean Payton has given us no inclination to not trust him. So you know what we're going to do? It's like a trust fall exercise. We're going to trust that this move pays off, and hopefully the Broncos offensive line can pay, you know, pay dividends for.
Right. And it's funny you mentioned, Cody, looking at the other, you know, the other side, like in this case, the New Orleans Twitter, you know, accounts, the reporters, people like that. I actually have it pulled up for a couple of quotes here from guys. So Nick Underhill, who writes for New Orleans.football, the New Orleans network, I guess, covers the Saints for them. He says this is a loss for the coaching staff. Zach Strief is one of the smartest people in the building. Then you look at what Jeff Duncan, I know he covered quite a bit of this saga between Sean Payton and the Broncos. He said, I'm sure this wasn't an easy decision for Zach Strief, who has made New Orleans his home since being drafted by the Saints in 2006. So that was the year Sean Payton came aboard. Career-wise, though, he says it's a no-brainer, a promotion, a new challenge, and a chance to work for one of the best offensive minds in the business. And so, Cody, you look at some of these comments that these guys are making. They're talking about how this is going to be a tough loss for the Saints. This is one of the smartest guys in the building. Major loss for the Saints. Jeff Duncan adds a rising star in the profession, one of the best young offensive coaches in the league, a major acquisition for Sean Payton as he assembles his staff. I'll take those recommendations, I guess, from people who know what he brings to the table as a coach, from talking to the coaches, from talking to the GM or whoever else. Those are the endorsements that you want at this point, especially for, I think, fans in Broncos country who are maybe holding out hope specifically for Mike Munchak, but even Dan Ruchar as well.
Yeah, I wouldn't even be surprised if one of those guys gets the other job potentially, kind of what Bill Kollar did this past year, right? The senior assistant type thing there, or like a consultant. Part of me wonders if Mike Munchak or Ruchar would be willing to consult. I mean, Ruchar could even coach tight ends as an option as well. I know that they're looking at different things for Denver there, but also another thing that's worth noting on Tuesday, the Broncos, they missed out on one of their defensive coordinators that they were looking to target in Brian Flores. He accepted the job with the Minnesota Vikings for their defensive coordinator job. So that means that the door is wide open right now, essentially, for Sean Desai, the defensive coordinator, associate head coach with the Seattle Seahawks, to have an opportunity to come in and do it. And I think at that point, you preserve the defense as well. It is the Vic Fangio defense. He's under the Fangio tree of disciples. And you know what? Maybe that's the best move for the Broncos right now. And, as soon as Sean Payton meets with him on Tuesday, there is a chance that he could sign quickly. So obviously if that happens, you get an update here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But Sayre, your quick thoughts on defensive coordinator with the sign with Flores taking a job elsewhere.
I think kind of a bummer to see Flores take another job before talking to the Broncos, but at the same time, still excited about the possibilities. We know, Vic Fangio was on the radar, Brian Flores on the radar. Could there be somebody lurking behind the scenes? We know not a lot is leaking, Cody. The tinfoil hat theory, theorist in me wants to say maybe they poach Mike Zimmer off of that Coach Prime staff. I know he's not on there in an official capacity yet. Doesn't have like a bio on the CU Buffs athletic website or anything. Maybe Mike Zimmer, Cody, who has ties. He was name dropped, remember, at the Sean Payton press conference. Maybe Mike Zimmer is a candidate to keep an eye on as a sleeper.
Maybe that was one of the mystery candidates we heard about initially behind the scenes through this all. Time will only tell here. And one thing is for certain, Broncos country, we will have you covered every step of the way here on Lockdown Broncos. You can get this podcast wherever you get your podcast in audio format, or you can watch us on YouTube so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more. On today's episode of the show, though, Sean Payton has already come in and made several changes to the Broncos coaching staff. Who are some coaches that are departing officially going into 2023? You'll get that on today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Ultimate Football GM. And if you've ever dreamed about being a general manager of a football team, now is your chance to do just that, all in the palm of your hands. With Ultimate Football GM, you're responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right coaches and coordinators, trading players, navigating your franchise through free agency and the draft and all the ups and downs of a season. And all of this comes in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline, where you could play on the go as you want to and when you want to. And we've created Locked On leagues for you to compete against other Locked On fans all across the world. Can you be the ultimate Locked On Football GM? Choose the Locked On League in the app to join. Can you create a football dynasty? Locked On Broncos listeners get a 100% free boost to the franchise when using promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps. So make sure you check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. As we continue on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, Sean Payton has already begun to make changes to the coaching staff and some assistants who were on staff last year. With in mind, he's looking to bring in coaches of his own and maybe preserve some of the coaches as well in Dove Valley. Thank you once again, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. If you're not making us your first listen every day, here's why you should, because when you want fresh, up-to-date, accurate coverage of all things that are going on in Dove Valley, this is the place to be on your favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you watch on YouTube. Sayre, since Sean Payton's introductory press conference, there has been some things that have gotten out about former coaches under, Nathaniel Hackett that are still under contract that were essentially released, right? Starting with Ejiro Evero. I do want to point this out there. A lot of people are thinking that Sean Payton didn't want to keep Evero. Sean Payton wanted to keep Ejiro Evero. That was one thing he wanted to do, is preserve the defense, keep Evero. Evero wanted to go elsewhere, and so he granted him the ability to go do that. There are some assistants I do think will stay on, and we'll dive into that obviously a little bit, once it's confirmed or once it's official. But Payton has already moved on from several coaches on Hackett's former staff.
Well, he has, including the guy who, Cody, remember, Ben Steele, he took over the offensive line from Butch Berry after interim head coach Jerry Rosberg fired Butch Berry. Then Ben Steele took over. Remember when Ben Steele was hired, there was the whole theory because Aaron Rodgers' first ever preseason touchdown pass, he threw it to Ben Steele, right? Is that the right guy? I'm thinking of the right guy. So Ben Steele then comes on. Yeah, it was him. It was him. My brain's still there, Cody. We're fresh. It was less than a year ago, basically, at this point. So you have all these theories and these pieces. So Ben Steele, no longer on the Denver Broncos staff, but obviously, we'll see what happens. Maybe he goes and joins Hackett out there with the New York Jets. And you also, on the offensive side, tight ends coach Jake Moreland. Remember, he came to the Broncos from the Jets last year. So maybe he rejoins that New York staff out there with Roberts, already familiar with the team. And then Peter Hansen, the linebackers coach, who, Cody, I felt like he was one of the better assistants on the team last year, maximized a lot of players, including Alex Singleton, including Jonas Griffith, really, who became kind of almost a breakout player candidate throughout the offseason, suffered the unfortunate preseason injury, but was poised to make a big impact. So those three assistants we know for sure will not be back.
Well, and a guy like Peter Hansen, for me, I always felt like if Ejiro ever got promoted, let's say he stayed with the team for a couple of years, got a head coaching job, I always thought that Peter Hansen could be an in-house defensive coordinator candidate for Denver because of the fact he was a defensive coordinator, linebacker coach at UNLV before he came over to the Denver Broncos. He's coached with Vic Fangio and Jim Harbaugh in San Francisco back in 2011, 2014 when they went to back-to-back NFC championship games. And then obviously, we're able to make it to the Super Bowl in one of those years. But, for me, you have to figure out, okay, how can you get the most out of the linebacker position, right? And I felt like Peter Hansen did a really good job of communicating things like eye discipline, understanding your zone, and not being able to, turn your back and look. And I think that's why you saw instinctual play from guys like Alex Singleton, from guys like Josie Jewell, who had career years. So I think it's no surprise, right? So I think whoever Denver brings in a linebacker coach, I'll be very intrigued to see who it is and maybe what ties they have and what, emphasis on player development that they've had. Now, to your point about Jake Moreland, what was the biggest thing that we had in our mind last year? Why is Albert Okwuegbunam playing more? And I thought Dan Orlovsky did a great job on NFL Live. I'm not sure if you saw it or not, but I was watching that, and he was talking about how Sean Payton, now being the guy in Denver, could be huge for guys like Greg Dulcich, maybe even Albert O in that situation. And he even compared, I don't know if he compared size, because obviously I don't think you could compare the size of a guy like Greg Dulcich to a guy like Jimmy Graham. But he said, imagine how Jimmy Graham was moving around at the tight end position. That's going to be what's going to happen. That's what's going to happen essentially with a guy like Greg Dulcich. And I was like, okay, I like that. But I'm also excited to see maybe what this means for Albert O, because I think this could also light a fire under him as well. Maybe he comes into a situation with a coaching staff who has no preconceived judgments on him, right? That he's just allowed to go out there and compete and then maybe earn that respect from the coaching staff. But I do expect to see a different Albert O, but this is a big offseason for him. I mean, this is going to be a big training camp for him as well.
It really is. And it's going to be fascinating to see, like you mentioned, maybe Ben Rouchard does come in and coach the tight ends. He does have some experience there. And that will give you, I think, the clearest indicator yet. The doghouse for players, the proverbial doghouse, I should say, is one of the most frustrating things because coaches play coy about it throughout the season and you don't really know exactly what's going on. And then you hear, Jerry Rosburg come out and talk about how, well, I see this guy out there at practice. I have no idea why he's not playing. He goes out the next game and gets a touchdown, and leads the team in receiving. So I just think it's one of those things where these guys needed a fresh start a little bit, get that kind of bad taste out of their mouths and get a new coaching staff in the building that can really pour into them and develop them. As we heard Sean Payton talk about with Russell Wilson, and he said this applies to every player. He's talking about how we need to find out what they do well, and we need to build the offense around that. And I think that's to your point about Jimmy Graham. There's so many different versions of the New Orleans Saints offense that like my mind has to I have to dig through like the filing cabinet in my brain to remember. Like there was the Reggie Bush offense, and there was the offense with Jimmy Graham, and there was the Marquez Colston offense, and there was with Emmanuel Sanders out there, there's Michael Thomas, there's all these different Alvin Kamara, all these different pieces, the Taysom Hill offense you could go through your own filing cabinet and just think through all these different eras of Saints football and think to yourself, okay, the Broncos now have this guy at the helm. He's the head of the operation, and that benefits the players greatly. He's going to put a staff around him that, as CEO Greg Penner said, a staff that the ownership group and the team and the fans will be proud of. I thought that was a great way for him to put it. So I'm excited for that. I think the players should be excited for that, and we'll see what happens on the field. Again, all of this is hypothetical. We wanted to be talking about hard news, right, all offseason. Now we're talking about hard news, but it shifts us into a new form of the hypothetical, hoping that these guys, these coaches, can help the players work it out.
And that's what it's all about at the end of the day is guiding your players to the best avenue to turn things around. Like the winning culture needs to return in Denver. As we said, the locker room culture is fine. It is fine. But, guys like Justin Simmons, they want to win. And you know what? Guys like Justin Simmons deserve to win alongside with all the other players, because some of these guys that Denver's drafted in the, premier rounds, we talk about guys like Jerry Jeudy, Patrick Surtain. All they're used to from high school to college is winning, right? So the transition in the NFL has been different because Denver has not been a winning team. Sean Payton is a proven winner. I guarantee you he's going to get a lot out of this roster. And as Payton said, it's not for everybody. So part of me is also wondering, what does that mean? Who does that weed out of the Broncos, this offseason training camp, whatever you may have? That's an interesting thing to ponder. But another thing we're going to discuss on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is the relationship and marriage between George Paton and Sean Payton could be better than what we had even believed beforehand. We'll dive into why on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports done right, and with the Prize Picks app, you pick 2 to 6 players, and if they will go score more or less in their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry, and these players will have a projection that's set by Prize Picks, and you simply choose whether or not they will have more or less than their Prize Picks projection. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections that are available. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports, and first-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks is going to throw you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Do not forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And our good friends over there at Built Bar, the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. And folks, what if I were to tell you that you could get a protein bar that's covered in 100% milk chocolate that has 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar, and not to mention, it tastes just like a candy bar, whether you pop it into the fridge for an hour for a little bit of a crunchier taste, or if you're like Sayre and you want to put it in the microwave for 10 seconds and have a gooey dessert-like treat, you can have that with Built Bar today. And the best part about it is now, instead of just getting it at Built.com, you can go to your local Walmart, to the pharmacy department, and you can get a 4-pack of Built Bar. You can also go to Sam's Club and get a bulk box of Built Bar that contains flavors like peanut butter, churro, and also coconut almond, and a wide variety of other flavors. You can get that today at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. Or as always, you can always go to Built.com as well to check it out. Make sure you get yourself a Built Bar, take a bite into it, and thank us later. As we continue on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we're going to dive into why Sean Payton and George Paton's relationship could propel the Broncos to new heights in 2023 and beyond here. And Sayre, I think one of the things we always have to address, some of the narratives that we were told, or, that a lot of people tweeted out, like, oh, Sean Payton is just going to come in and there's no reason for George Payton to be here now that Sean Payton's here. And in my head, I thought about it at the time, and I said, okay, in what situation does a head coach come in, right? Unless you're Bill Belichick. At what point do you come in as a head coach and all of a sudden you have control over the roster, coaches, the moves that you're making, the NFL draft? Like, it's rare to ever see a coach who has that. And I think that perception comes from the fact that, Sean Payton comes from the Bill Parcells coaching tree. But for me, we didn't get that vibe in Monday's introductory press conference. And the relationship, it seems like, between George Payton and Sean Payton is very, very positive so far. And look, Sayre, I'm going to say it here. If the Broncos hope to be successful, these two guys are going to be the most integral parts of making the Broncos a winning football team. And I'm excited to see how they work together.
I am too, Cody. I really am, especially after hearing them kind of talk about just the connection that they made early on. And it was speculated about, but I think that the ideal scenario in this whole process is that somebody like Sean Payton would really hit it off with George Payton, because Broncos fans don't necessarily all unanimously view George Payton in the greatest light, right? They look at him and they see, well, we haven't done well enough in free agency. The Russell Wilson trade at this point hasn't worked out. We have no draft picks, all these different things. They look at George Payton, they blame him for that. After just a little less than a year ago, we were about to build him a statue outside the stadium for making that Russell Wilson trade. But you know what? I look at George Payton, and to me, Cody, I think he is one of the sharpest football minds in the NFL executive world. And I think that when anybody like Sean Payton, of course, somebody who loves the game, somebody who, probably believes pretty strongly that he could put together a good roster, I don't think he's opposed to being collaborative. Like he asked out loud during his press conference, he's like, where are all these rumors about me kind of being like this iron fist coming from? Like, what? I'm not some kind of like dictator or anything. He, I think, would rather be collaborative with a general manager, because when those relationships are working, the football operation is running well. And he spoke to that specifically. This quote that he has, I want to share it again. I feel like I've got good instincts, Sean Payton said. He said, I feel like there's a demeanor with him, meaning George Payton, that reminds me of Mickey Loomis in a good way. Very steady. I've always respected the teams that he's been part of. So you look at that statement, you see just kind of the interactions. Then you hear him talk to, I was listening to an interview that he did with Alexis Perry, and he was talking to her about the fact that, man, I really hit it off with George Payton. Essentially, it sounds like these two are getting along way better than anyone expected, when a lot of people, Cody, including reporters, had written off the possibility of Sean Payton because of, remember, George Payton's perceived job security. If Payton is still in the GM chair, people thought, well, there's no way Sean Payton's coming to Denver. He wants to be in control of everything. As we're coming to find out, that's not the case.
Well, and I think that gives you some optimism as well. If you're a Broncos fan saying, okay, let's trust the process here. Like for me, George Payton has been on the job for 2 years, right? He's going to his third year as a GM. I think that his first year, he nailed the draft. Look at how many of those guys were playing and starting, right? So I don't know the hindsight revisionist history that he's not a good GM by some fans because of that. Free agency last year, I think DJ Jones, I think Alex Singleton, I think K'Wan Williams, those guys were fantastic, right? And usually I think everyone looks for like a 100% success rate. Like Randy Gregory, I would say through the first 4 weeks since he was acquired, was absolutely as advertised. But then you have the injury. There's not much you can do when a player suffers an injury. And granted, that was a huge risk for George Payton to take with Gregory. But I think Gregory can be a very pivotal piece of this Broncos defense for the next several years. And the biggest thing is, can he stay healthy? If he stays healthy, I have no issues about that. I think he can be a huge time contributor. Nobody expected Billy Turner, who eventually ended up starting in a majority of the games for the Broncos after coming back from his injury, offseason knee surgery. Free agency, I think he had pretty much close to a 50% success rate with those guys. So I don't understand this whole, he's bad in free agency. Not to mention everyone's pissed at him about the draft picks, but here's the reality. If the Broncos were winning and Russell Wilson led the Broncos to the playoffs last year, nobody's talking about these draft picks, right? It's always like, if you're winning, nobody cares about it. If you're losing, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did that. That to me, I think, is the thing that drives me the most crazy about some of these theories and some of these narratives that we see. Let's just look at it for what it is. It was a great move at the time. Has it worked out in terms of the Russell Wilson trade yet? No, it hasn't. Russ has to really come out in 2023 and prove that he was the right decision for them, despite having the worst year of his career. And even then, his worst year of his career was better than something the Broncos had previously had. So there's got to be growth there. There's got to be improvement. And I just think that George Paton probably gets cast off as a little bit of a scapegoat in a sense. Granted, his hire of Nathaniel Hackett wasn't the best move that he's ever made, but I think people forget how good George Paton is, how well respected across the NFL that George Paton is with various league executives, to the point, as we mentioned in that survey that was conducted 2 years ago, George Paton is the most trustworthy executive as voted on by his peers, by agents around the NFL. To me, that stands for principle. That stands for value. I think Denver's in good hands with he and Sean Payton, man. So I'm stoked to see what these guys can do together.
I am too, Cody. And God forbid you learn from your mistakes, right? I think that's one of the things, like you said. It is. I mean, it really is. You talk about just like people expecting the 100% hit rate, and I get it. You know, it's all about winning. At the end of the day, the bottom line of the NFL, it's all about winning. NFL is not for long. You know, that's what people say. But at the same time, you should be afforded an opportunity to make a mistake and then correct it and learn from it. I think that that's the thing about that's a deeper topic, I guess, for the society that we live in nowadays. Everybody wants everything to be microwaved. You want the microwave success. And I understand it. I'm as impatient as anybody, Cody, for the Broncos to get back to winning, to be playing in meaningful games, to not be celebrating a new head coach, rather talking about the crazy things our players are saying at Super Bowl interviews. I would much rather be talking about that than talking about new head coach. But look, you have to give these guys some room for error at times to go out and build things their way. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and you move on at the appropriate time. People just want to see it doesn't work for 1 or 2 years. You pull the plug, you start over, you push reset. That's not always the right thing to do. So I think expecting 100% hit rate is unreasonable. I think for George Paton now, it is go time, though. It is now, okay, you've been able to make the mistakes and reset. You know what, like you mentioned, the Hackett move. We'll see how Russell Wilson rebounds, those different types of things. Now, with Sean Payton in place, how do things look going forward? I think that's going to loom large over George Payton's job going forward. But it's good to know, and it's good to see and hear that he and Sean Payton getting along well already, working together well in each other's offices already. That's really a positive sign for the Denver Broncos.
I like your analogy that you used about everybody just wants to microwave their food now these days. I prefer to preheat the oven, man. So you know what happens? That takes some time and then ends up coming out better. So let's hope that the Broncos are preheating the oven here for Sean Payton, George Paton, the relationship that these guys are building, and hopefully it leads to better results for the Broncos this upcoming season. Broncos country, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the show. That'll wrap up what we have on today's episode of the podcast. We'll be back tomorrow with more Broncos news as it happens. Any tidbits we get from Super Bowl Radio Row here in beautiful Phoenix, Arizona, the home of Super Bowl 57. With that said, we'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show.